Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game was released in August of 2010 on both Xbox Live Arcade as well as the PlayStation Network. The Scott Pilgrim vs. the World movie was released in the same month as the game, however the game more followed the plot of the graphic novels rather than the movie. The game was developed by Ubisoft Montreal, which is among Ubisoft's largest subsidiaries, known for the latter Assassin's Creed games as well as the modern Far Cry games. The plot to Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, is that Scott Pilgrim falls in love with a girl named Ramona Flowers, but in order to date her, he has to fight her 7 evil ex-boyfriends. Most of the plot is laid out in the first screen of the game, with little to no plot taking place after that, but it's enough to get the point across. It really has the NES, here's kinda what's happening, and go save the world, go! Vibe. The game's retro-inspired vibe oozes throughout the entire game. The game's overworld map is extremely reminiscent of Super Mario Bros. 3, if the worlds looked like the overworld map in Yo Noid. There's references to tons of retro games, including Final Fantasy VI, Super Mario, Kirby, Street Fighter, and Mega Man, just to name a few. Aside from all the game references, the game's gameplay itself is heavily inspired by River City Ransom. Scott Pilgrim's gameplay is a beat-em-up with some RPG elements. By collecting money from the enemies you defeat, you're able to go into shops where you can buy items to upgrade your stats. This does force you to replay some of the levels to level up before you can move on, but it adds a nice replayability to a beat-em-up game with only 7 levels. Each of the levels manages to be vastly different from each other, with hardly any assets being reused from level to level. Each level has its own unique feel, with scripted events on each level that really sets each level apart from one another. The game's combat overall feels pretty good, however once you've maxed out a character, the super fast movement speed can be a little daunting. With max speed, it's extremely easy to overstep what you're aiming for. The huge number of weapons you can pick up in this game are pretty cool. It's fun to pick up everything from a beer bottle to a brick to a katana. Each item also has its own unique stats as well, such as range, how much damage it does, and how it moves on the ground. Some items, if you slide into them, will react differently than others. For instance, pots will break, and blocks of ice will slide around super fast, doing damage to anything they hit. The way everything in the game seems to have weight really makes it a great beat-em-up title. When the screen is littered with items and enemies, things can get really chaotic with items bouncing around in the funniest ways, and learning to use items in the environment to your advantage is a lot of fun. Each level concludes with a boss that has a unique moveset. All the bosses are really fun and almost the highlight of each level. The second stage, for instance, has you doing battle with a band on stage, and as the fight progresses, you end up in a cluttered alleyway full of objects that can bounce around. Or one of the forms of the final bosses is reminiscent of the Statue of the Gods from Final Fantasy VI. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game has some of the best beat-em-up gameplay that I've ever seen in the genre, and everything feels really solid. The game has 4-player local multiplayer, which I've actually never played, but I've been told by a number of friends the more players you get into games, the more laggy it will become. The game also featured online multiplayer, which is only playable if you bought the multiplayer DLC for the game, which is kind of a scumbag move, but it actually gets worse. On December 30th of 2014, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game and all the DLC for the game was delisted from the Xbox Live Arcade as well as the PlayStation Network. This was due to Ubisoft's license on the series expiring. This means that the game is no longer available for anyone that didn't buy the game when it was available. Unfortunately, a PC port was never made, so unless you were lucky enough to buy it during its short 3.5 years on the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Arcade, you probably won't get another chance to buy this game. Graphically, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game is a pixel art masterpiece. The game looks extremely reminiscent of a Neo Geo game with some super detailed sprites and high frame rate movement. The game's art direction and animation was headed by Paul Robinson, who is known for providing the art direction on a number of games, including Contra 4 on the Nintendo DS, and most recently the kickstarted game Mercenary Kings in 2013. Overall, graphically, I think that this game has easily some of the best pixel art I've ever seen in any game. It's detailed, highly animated, has a unique artistic direction, and consistently is a pleasure to look at. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game's soundtrack was composed by the chiptune band Anamanaguchi. Prior to this game's release, I had already been listening to Anamanaguchi for a few years, so I was super excited to hear the soundtrack was being composed by them. The game's soundtrack is among the best I can think of. Anamanaguchi's style of using chiptunes generated from NES with live instruments completely blows the soundtrack out of the water. There isn't a single bad track on the entire soundtrack and can totally be listened to outside of the game. Overall, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game is a modern beat-em-up masterpiece. The RPG elements add a lot of replayability to the game, allowing you to max out your stats on several characters, and the gameplay itself feels really great with amazing combat. The graphics and music in this game are also outstanding and combine with the game's gameplay to offer a really fantastic package. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game is still one of the best beat-em-ups of all time, and I probably couldn't recommend this game to fans of retro beat-em-ups or just retro fans in general enough. The only problem with the game is that if you weren't lucky enough to buy it when it was available, there's a fairly strong chance you'll never be able to own this game, digital or otherwise.